In the pale dawn of 1849, Georgia, the barn smelled of sweat, hay, and sin. The young heir's cries mixed with the muffled sobs of 3 enslaved women. When the door burst open, the master stood silent, eyes cold, jaw trembling, not from shock, but from the punishment already forming in his mind. The McAllister plantation stretched over 600 acres of fertile Georgian soil, a kingdom of white fences and quiet terror. It wasn't merely land. It was a living organism that fed on obedience and fear. Every breath of wind carried whispers through the sugarcane and pine, stories of vanished slaves and midnight punishments never recorded. The master, William McAllister, was a man of rigid morality but twisted pride. His reputation as a Christian patriarch masked decades of cruelty justified by Scripture. His son, Thomas, had returned from Savannah that spring, a young man of 20, educated, proud, and reckless. Rumors of his fascination with the enslaved women had reached even the kitchen quarters, where whispers could cost lives. The 3 women at the center of this storm, Clara, June, and Abigail, were bonded not by choice but by shared torment. Each bore the marks of the master's rule differently. Clara, silent and strong. June, defiant and often beaten. Abigail, soft-spoken, haunted by her child lost to the fields. The barn was where they hid from the world, the only place where time seemed to pause. Thomas had been seen lingering there after dusk, his shadow cutting long across the hay. The overseer had warned him once, quietly, "Sir, your father don't forgive sin, especially when it bears his name." But sin had already taken root. On that fateful night, lantern light flickered behind wooden slats, revealing bodies tangled in shame and defiance. The sound of boots on gravel broke the spell. The barn door creaked open to reveal William McAllister, his silhouette framed in hellish orange from the torch he carried. He did not shout. He only looked. And when he turned to the overseer, his voice was cold as winter. "Fetch the minister. The boy's gonna marry them, every last one." The words hung heavy, impossible, final. If you'd lived on that land, would you have believed it was justice or madness wearing a Sunday face? The sun rose slow and red over the McAllister estate, staining the fog like spilled blood. By 6, every soul on the plantation had been ordered to gather before the big house. The air felt thick, the way it does before a storm. Except this one was human. The overseer's whip rested loose in his hand, a reminder that even silence had a price. From the upper porch, William McAllister stood unmoving, his cane pressed against the floorboards. His gray eyes scanned the crowd, slaves in torn linen, townsfolk in their Sunday coats, a few curious merchants who had ridden in from miles away after hearing of the scandal. No one spoke above a whisper. No bird sang. The plantation, alive only yesterday with the sounds of work, now held its breath. At the center of the yard knelt Thomas McAllister, the master's only son. His hands were bound before him with a length of rope polished by sweat. The white of his shirt was smeared with hay and dried tears. He had not eaten nor slept. Every time he lifted his eyes toward the house, he met his father's stare, cold, deliberate, unreadable. Behind him stood the 3 women, Clara, June, and Abigail. Someone had wrapped them in cut pieces of the mistress's old curtains, crude ghosts of wedding dresses. Clara's lips pressed together so tightly they were almost colorless. June stared into the distance as if already gone. Abigail clutched a fragment of ribbon, her child's, once bright blue, now faded to gray. The minister from town arrived, late, sweating despite the morning chill. He had preached before soldiers and sinners alike, yet never to such an audience. His trembling hands fumbled with the Bible as he faced the assembled. "We gather," he began, "to restore order in the eyes of the Lord." His voice cracked on the word Lord. William lifted one hand. "Proceed." Each vow fell like a hammer blow. Thomas's "I do" came out hoarse, almost broken. The women answered in whispers that no one could fully hear. When the final blessing was uttered, a low rumble rolled across the valley, though. The sky remained clear. Horses reared. A child began to cry. Even the minister stepped back, as if expecting the heavens to strike. William's verdict followed. They will live under my roof, together. Let their sin be my lesson to every man here. That evening, the new brides were marched to the abandoned servants' wing behind the house. As darkness crept in, faint singing drifted from their room. An old spiritual twisted into something mournful and strange. The sound unsettled even the overseer. He swore later the words weren't English, and that another voice sang with them, one no living soul could name. Would you have stayed to witness that union, or prayed never to hear it again? The servants' quarters had been empty for years, ever since fever took the field hands who once lived there. The walls still bore the stains of damp and smoke, and the floors creaked beneath every step as though remembering the feet that once shuffled across them. When the three women were led there that evening, they said nothing. The overseer, lantern in hand, pointed at the narrow room with 3 cots and turned away quickly, muttering a prayer under his breath. The door closed behind them with a dull thud, and silence filled the space. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sound of breathing, 3 different rhythms, heavy and uneven. Clara sat nearest the window, her back straight, eyes fixed on the oak outside. June knelt by the small iron stove, striking a match until flame met wick. Abigail sat apart, clutching her ribbon still, twisting it between trembling fingers as though it might bring her child back. That first night, no one spoke. The only sound was the rain that began to fall, tapping the tin roof in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, the barn door creaked, and the horses shifted uneasily. The plantation seemed to breathe, to listen. By morning, the 3 women moved quietly through their routines, fetching water, tending laundry, doing the same labor as before, but now under the eyes of both pity and curiosity. The other slaves avoided them. Some whispered that they were cursed, others that they were blessed, bound to the white man's house in a way that defied the order of things. At night, strange things began to happen. The oil lamps flickered, though there was no wind. Once, the overseer swore he saw a shadow pass across the window when all 3 women were inside asleep. Another time, a mirror in the main house cracked down the center without cause, the break glinting like a wound. Thomas avoided them for days, ashamed and afraid, but something in him kept drawing him back. One night, he crept toward the quarters, his steps muffled by wet earth. From within, he heard humming, low, melodic, unholy. The sound pulled at him, made his heart thrum like the pulse of a hunted animal. He placed a hand on the door but couldn't move it open. Inside, the 3 women sat in a circle around a single candle. The flame flickered blue, and their eyes glowed with the reflection. Abigail whispered first, "If he made us wives, then we will make him remember what that means." The wind outside shifted, and every dog on the plantation began to howl. "Tell me, would you have knocked on that door, or run until the sound faded behind you?" 3 nights passed before Thomas McAllister could no longer resist the pull of that sound. It began each evening after sundown, a low, rhythmic humming that drifted from the quarters and seemed to settle inside his bones. He told himself it was guilt, that what he heard was only his conscience. But in his dreams, the voices came closer, whispering his name with a tenderness that curdled into accusation. On the 4th night, unable to bear it, he lit a lantern and walked the long dirt path to the servants' wing. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and honeysuckle, though the season was wrong for it. The house dogs refused to follow him. One whimpered and slunk beneath the porch as he passed. Each step toward the quarters seemed to draw the night tighter, the crickets falling silent one by one. He paused at the door, his hand trembling around the brass handle. From inside came a faint melody, 3 voices now perfectly aligned, weaving through one another like strands of smoke. The tune was old, older than any hymn he knew. When he pushed the door open, the sound stopped. Inside, the candlelight was dim and strange. The 3 women sat together in the center of the room. Clara turned first, her eyes reflecting the lantern light like polished amber. June's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Abigail, sweet, broken Abigail, smiled faintly. the blue ribbon tied now around her wrist. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said. Her voice was calm, but it carried something sharp beneath it. "I came to—" "Speak," Thomas managed, though the words caught in his throat. "To apologize." "Apologies don't unmake what's been done," June whispered, not looking at him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Abigail rose slowly and took the lantern from his hand, setting it down beside the candle. The two flames flickered together, and in their light, Thomas saw markings on the wooden floor, charred lines forming a pattern like a wheel or sunburst. "What is this?" he breathed. "Something older than your father's God," Clara said. "Something that remembers when pain was answered." The air grew colder. The candle bent as if under a sudden wind, though the windows were shut. Thomas stumbled back toward the door, but Abigail caught his sleeve. Her fingers were ice. "You gave us your name," she said softly. "Now you will give us your truth." Outside, the lantern went out, though no one had touched it. "Would you have stayed to hear what came next, or prayed never to learn what your name could summon?" The next morning dawned gray and silent. The plantation's routines resumed, but a quiet unease hung over the land like fog. Workers moved slower, glancing often toward the servant quarters. The overseer claimed he heard voices before sunrise, low, rhythmic chanting that ended just as the first rooster crowed. When he told the master, William dismissed it with a glare. "You've been drinking," he said. But even he avoided looking toward the west wing where the three wives now lived. Inside those quarters, the air was thick with the smell of wax and iron. The floor markings from the night before had deepened, burned into the boards as if by fire, though no fire had been lit. Clara, June, and Abigail knelt beside the symbols, each holding something from her past. Clara's mother's rusted hair comb, June's piece of torn fabric from her whipping years ago, and Abigail's blue ribbon. These were not mere keepsakes, they were offerings. The women spoke softly, their voices weaving together into something that was neither prayer nor curse. They called it the remembrance. It was a ritual their mothers had whispered about, something forbidden, older than the chains that bound them. The belief was simple. If suffering was remembered in full, the earth itself would not rest until justice answered. When Thomas came again that evening, the women did not stop him. He entered hesitantly, hat in hand, face drawn from sleeplessness. "You've been calling me," he said quietly. "In my dreams. I hear you." Clara studied him, her gaze steady. "Then you've begun to remember." June rose, her bare feet silent on the wood. "You took from us what your father taught you to take. Now you will help us return what was lost." Thomas's breath quickened. "What do you mean?" Abigail stepped forward and pressed his hand against the burned mark on the floor. The heat seared his skin, though the wood was cool. For an instant, he saw flashes behind his eyes. Images that weren't his own, a child crying in the fields, a whip striking, a woman's voice begging for mercy. He staggered back, gasping. "Do you feel it now?" Clara asked softly. "The weight your family buried." He nodded, trembling. "Then the ritual has begun," June said, "and it will not stop until all debts are named." That night, a crimson glow was seen flickering through the cracks of the quarter's walls. Some said it was firelight, others swore it came from beneath the earth itself. If you had witnessed that glow, would you have run to help? Or stood, frozen, afraid of what might answer? By the seventh day, whispers of witchcraft had begun to ripple through the McAllister lands. Field hands crossed themselves at the mention of the three wives, and even the hounds refused to approach their quarters after dark. But William McAllister, proud and iron-willed, would hear none of it. He ruled his world by discipline, not superstition. To him, fear was just weakness wearing a spiritual mask. That morning, he sat in his study surrounded by ledgers, whiskey, and the faint hum of cicadas. The walls were lined with portraits of his ancestors, stern men, painted in heavy oils, watching from the shadows. He poured a drink, his hand steady, but his thoughts were not. The house had changed in ways he could not name. Food spoiled too quickly. mirrors fogged without cause. And once, just before dawn, he swore he saw a woman standing at the edge of the veranda, her figure outlined in white, unmoving. When he blinked, she was gone. His wife, Margaret, found him staring at the window later that day. "You brought this upon us," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from something deeper, a grief that had long curdled into bitterness. "That boy was never meant to be like you, William. You broke him trying." He turned sharply. "The boy sinned. I corrected him. I'll not have this house dishonored." "But it is dishonored," she whispered. "Every corner of it smells of judgment." Her words stung, but he said nothing more. When night fell, the candles flickered low. From the servant quarters came that same unearthly humming, slow, mournful, layered with something that sounded almost like weeping. William slammed his glass down, shattering it against the hearth. "Enough," he muttered, grabbing his cane. He crossed the yard with the fury of a man trying to silence his own fear. The moon was swollen, red around the edges. As he neared the quarters, the air grew colder. The windows glowed faintly as if a fire burned within, though no smoke rose. He pushed the door open. Inside he found Thomas kneeling again, eyes wide, skin pale. The three women surrounded him, their faces calm, their hands resting upon the scorched floor symbol. "Father," Thomas rasped, "they're not harming me. They're showing me." "Showing you what?" William demanded. "The truth," Clara said softly, "and it does not favor you." William raised his cane as if to strike, but stopped when the air thickened. Every candle went out at once. In the darkness, a voice, feminine, echoing, spoke from everywhere and nowhere. "Your blood remembers, William McAllister." The old man stumbled back, his faith cracking like old wood. "If you were him, would you have called it madness? Or, finally, confession?" The night pressed heavy upon the McAllister plantation, thick with the scent of iron and pine. The servants whispered that the moon itself refused to rise, as if heaven would not bear witness to what was unfolding below. Inside the old quarters, every candle flickered with unnatural rhythm, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits along the walls. William McAllister stood frozen in the doorway, his breath shallow. The three women stared back at him, their expressions not angry, but knowing. Clara spoke first, her tone steady and low. "Every family hides its crimes. Yours just wrote them down." She pointed toward the far wall where an old chest rested beneath a torn quilt. Thomas, still kneeling, turned to his father with trembling hands. "She says there's something inside, something that belongs to us both." William's cane trembled. "There is nothing here but wickedness." June's voice, calm but fierce, sliced through the dark. "Open it. Let your God see what he's blessed." The room seemed to shrink. The chest's hinges creaked as Thomas lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of ledgers, faded, brittle pages inked with careful handwriting. But these weren't mere account books. They were records, lists of names, dates, and punishments, dozens of them. The handwriting was William's. Abigail stepped forward, her face pale in the dim light. "Do you remember my child?" she asked softly. "She died at 5 years old, fever, they said. But the fever came after your whip." William's face blanched. "You lie." "She screamed for days," Abigail continued, her voice trembling now. "And your wife said to bury her before the neighbors asked questions." Thomas looked between them, horror dawning like sunrise. "Father, is it true?" William's mouth opened, but no words came. He sank onto the edge of the cot, his eyes hollow. "There were rules," he muttered. "There had to be order." Clara knelt before him. "Order built from pain is rot, not law." Then the candles flared. Blue, unnatural, cold. The air vibrated. Thomas felt something pass through him, like a breath too vast for his lungs. He saw images again, chains, fire, and a river red with the memory of those who never left. When the light dimmed, William wept. Truly wept. For the first time, the great patriarch looked small. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Not from you," Clara said. from what you carry." Her gaze turned to Thomas, whose hands now bore faint red marks, the same burned pattern as the floor. Outside, thunder rolled without rain. The house shuddered as if something beneath it had stirred awake. If you had been standing in that doorway, would you have believed it was justice or judgment? The storm that night never broke, though thunder rolled endlessly across the fields. The air grew thick with the smell of rain that never came. A suffocating tension hanging over every shingle and shutter of the McAllister estate. Inside the main house, candles guttered and died one by one, as if the flame itself feared to linger. In the quarters, Thomas sat against the wall, head bowed, hands still glowing faintly from the markings burned into his skin. William McAllister remained silent in the corner, defeated, his cane resting beside him like a relic of a dying empire. The three women stood before them in a triangle. Clara, at the front, her expression carved from stone. June, her eyes closed in concentration, and Abigail, holding her child's ribbon wrapped tightly around her wrist. "What happens now?" Thomas whispered. Clara's answer came slowly. "What always happens when debt is due." From beneath the floorboards came a low groan, as if the house itself shifted uneasily. The charred pattern beneath them, the circle of symbols burned into the wood, began to glow faintly red. The women began to hum again, the same melody Thomas had once heard from a distance, but now it carried something deeper, sorrow mixed with power. William forced himself to his feet. "Stop this," he rasped. "You'll damn us all." June opened her eyes, meeting his with quiet fury. "You damned us long before tonight. You sold our blood, our children, our bodies, and thought the earth forgot." He stepped back, trembling. "You don't understand. This land was built on work, not evil." Clara's voice cut through him like a blade. "This land was built on graves." As the humming rose, Thomas's vision blurred. He saw the faces of slaves who had died here, hundreds of them, flickering through the dim air like embers in wind. Some he recognized from portraits his father once kept. Others were strangers, but all stared with the same hollow knowing. The sound of chains echoed faintly, though none were visible. Abigail stepped closer to Thomas and pressed her hand to his chest. "You carry his name, but you can end his curse," she said softly. "Blood took this land. Blood can set it free." William lunged forward. "Don't touch him!" But the circle flared brighter, stopping him mid-step. His voice broke into a strangled cry as the heat rose around his feet. The symbols blazed white-hot, crawling across the floor toward him like living veins. Thomas tried to move, but the women held him steady. The humming grew louder, no longer a song, but a chorus of every soul the master's cruelty had silenced. When the light finally dimmed, William McAllister lay still upon the boards, his eyes open, his mouth frozen mid-word. The air smelled faintly of iron and cedar, and beneath his body, the earth began to drink. If you had seen it, his fall, his silence, would you have called it vengeance or balance restored? By morning, the air on the McAllister plantation felt wrong. The fog lay heavy, unmoving, and the fields, usually alive with the drone of insects, were silent as a church before a funeral. Workers who ventured near the quarters whispered of a stillness that bent the very air, as though the soil itself had begun to breathe. William McAllister's body had been removed before dawn, though no one dared touch him barehanded. The overseer wrapped him in a blanket and buried him near the oak grove, where generations of McAllisters already slept. Yet even as the last shovelful of dirt fell, the ground pulsed once faintly, like a heart beneath the earth. The men crossed themselves and left without looking back. Inside the quarters, Thomas sat motionless. He had not spoken since the night before. His hands, once burned by the ritual's light, now bore faint black lines tracing up his arms like roots. The three women tended to him quietly, neither fearful nor tender, simply knowing. Clara was the first to break the silence. "It has begun," she said. "The land remembers now." June stood by the window, staring toward the fields where the morning sun failed to rise. "The air tastes like iron," she murmured. like blood waking. Outside, small signs appeared. Crows gathered in unnatural numbers, circling over the grove. The horses refused their feed. A strange reddish film coated the water in the well. And every so often, the earth trembled. Not enough to shake the house, but enough to make nails creak and dust fall from the rafters. Thomas finally spoke. "I saw them," he said hoarsely. "All of them. The ones buried beneath the cane rows. The children. The men my father worked to death. They're still here." Abigail's hand trembled as she touched her ribbon. "They've been waiting." That evening thunder rumbled again, though the sky was clear. When the wind picked up, the sound it carried wasn't like wind at all. It was voices, faint, mournful, endless. The slaves in the cabins fell to their knees, praying, singing, crying. Even the overseer fled into the forest, muttering scripture under his breath. In the main house, pictures fell from walls. Dishes cracked. The McAllister crest above the hearth split clean down the middle. And in the fields, the earth began to move. Slowly, as if something beneath it was stirring after a long, hungry sleep. Thomas stared through the window, pale and shaking. "What have we done?" he whispered. Clara turned toward him, her face lit by a faint red glow rising from the horizon. "You didn't free them," she said quietly. "You woke them. If you'd stood there, would you have seen deliverance or the birth of a reckoning long delayed?" That night, the plantation held its breath. The wind rose from the west, carrying a deep, bone-born sound, half moan, half song. The fields swayed, though no breeze touched them. It was as if the land itself had begun to move under invisible hands. From the slave quarters to the main house, doors shook, hinges screamed, and walls seemed to groan with the weight of 1,000 buried memories. Inside the old quarters, Thomas McAllister knelt again in the circle of burned symbols, his eyes vacant, his hands resting in his lap like offerings. The marks up his arms glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the tremors beneath the floorboards. Clara, June, and Abigail stood around him, their faces calm, faces that no longer looked entirely human. The hum began again, low and deep. It was not merely the women now. The sound filled the air from everywhere, the earth, the trees, the very stones of the foundation. The light in the room dimmed until all color fled. Then the air grew sharp, electric. From the open doorway, Margaret McAllister, the matriarch, appeared clutching her rosary. Her hair was unpinned, her eyes wild with disbelief. "You're calling devils," she cried. "You'll damn us all." Clara turned to her slowly. "Your prayers kept us bound. Our voices will set us free." The rosary beads snapped in. Margaret's hands. The wooden cross clattered to the floor and split in two. At that moment, the floorboards heaved. The burnt circle cracked open, releasing a smell of wet earth and decay. Thomas gasped as light, red like embers seen through smoke, rose upward, swirling around the room in spirals. From that light, faint shapes began to form. Faces, arms, the indistinct outlines of men, women, and children, all shimmering with the dust of the soil. They were not ghosts. They were memories given form. Every injustice the McAllisters had buried beneath sermons and ledgers now stood before them, silent and endless. William's voice echoed faintly, though his body lay cold in the grove. "My land," he whispered from nowhere. "My land." Thomas's head lifted. Not anymore. The red light expanded, seeping into the walls, into the ground, until every corner of the plantation glowed faintly with it. Outside, the fields rippled as if breathing. Then, one by one, the great oak trees began to tilt, their roots dragging from the soil like tendons tearing free. The hum became a roar, ancient, sorrowful, unstoppable. And just before the sound consumed everything, Clara whispered to the boy who bore the McAllister name, "Now the land remembers." If you had stood in those fields, would you have begged for mercy or bowed to the justice that rose from the ground? By dawn, the McAllister plantation was gone. not burned, not destroyed, simply gone. What once stood as 600 acres of ordered cruelty had turned to ash-gray soil and whispering mist. No birds sang, no tools struck metal. The land had fallen into a silence so complete it felt alive, listening to its own heartbeat beneath the surface. Those who lived nearby spoke of waking to a strange stillness that morning. The horizon where the grand house once stood was veiled in fog, and the trees that had lined the drive were blackened and twisted, their roots above ground like the fingers of the dead. Some swore they saw figures walking in the haze, barefoot, moving in lines, fading before reaching the edge of the field. None dared step closer. At the center of that emptiness, the old servant quarters still stood, half collapsed, the wood scorched from within. Inside, Thomas McAllister sat against a beam, his body pale, still breathing, but barely. His hands were clean now, no markings, no burns. Around him, the floor had split open, revealing the black earth below, soft and damp. There was no sign of Clara, June, or Abigail. Only their faint scent lingered, wax, smoke, and honeysuckle. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light. His first sound was not a cry, but a question whispered into the emptiness. Did it end? A breeze drifted through the broken window. Somewhere far off, the faint sound of humming echoed, gentle, like a lullaby sung to a restless child. It faded, then returned, circling him softly. Thomas bowed his head. Tears fell, darkening the dirt beneath him. In the grove, where William McAllister had been buried, the ground had sunk several feet, leaving the coffin half exposed. The men sent to rebury him refused, claiming the soil burned through their gloves. They said the air above the grave shimmered, red at dusk, and the roots of the oaks had begun to twist around the coffin like snakes. By the week's end, the McAllister name was spoken only in whispers. The county clerk struck it from the property records. The church refused to mention it, and those who wandered near the land after sundown told the same story. They heard voices singing from the earth, 3 voices, bound in perfect harmony. They say when the wind turns from the east, the fields hum again. The song of the enslaved, the lament of the land, and the prayer of a son who finally saw what justice looked like when God chose silence. If you walked that ground today, would you call it cursed or finally cleansed?